The guards found her body curled in the corner of the stone cell, fingers worn to bone from clawing at the walls. Princess Blanche of Bourbon had been dead for hours, maybe days. Nobody was keeping track anymore. The woman who should have been Queen of Castile, who should have ruled one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, had instead died alone in a tower, forgotten by the world that once celebrated her beauty and grace. Her crime? Marrying the wrong man. Her punishment? 7 years of imprisonment, starvation, and systematic destruction that would make modern human rights activists weep. But here's what really happened to Princess Blanche. Here's the story they don't want you to know about medieval marriage, political power, and how a king could legally torture his own wife to death while the entire world watched and did nothing. Before we dive into this tale of royal horror, I want you to subscribe to this channel. It's the fastest way to join us for every future exploration into the darkest corners of forgotten history. Because what you're about to hear isn't just the story of one princess. It's a window into a world where women were political pawns, where marriage was warfare, and where even royalty could disappear into the shadows of their own castles. The story of Princess Blanche begins not with love, but with mathematics. Cold, calculated political arithmetic that would determine whether kingdoms rose or fell, whether armies marched or retreated, whether alliances held or crumbled into dust. In 1353, when Blanche was just 16 years old, she had already become the most valuable piece on Europe's political chessboard. Not because of her intelligence, though she was remarkably educated for her time. Not because of her beauty, though contemporary accounts describe her as radiant. She was valuable because she was French royalty in an age when French blood could buy you a kingdom or get you killed. The marriage proposal came from Castile, one of Spain's most powerful kingdoms. King Pedro, known to history as Pedro the Cruel, needed a wife. More specifically, he needed a political alliance that would secure his throne against rebellious nobles and foreign threats. The French court saw opportunity. Blanche would marry Pedro, becoming Queen of Castile, and France would gain a powerful ally in the ongoing 100 Years' War against England. It seemed perfect, a strategic masterstroke that would benefit everyone involved, everyone except Blanche herself. Picture the scene at the French court when the marriage contract was signed. Nobles in elaborate robes discussing trade routes and military support while 16-year-old Blanche stood silently, her future decided by men who saw her as a diplomatic tool rather than a human being. The dowry negotiations took weeks. The ceremony planning took months. But nobody bothered to ask what the bride wanted because what she wanted was irrelevant. She was royal currency, and currency doesn't get to choose how it's spent. The wedding took place in 1353 with all the pageantry expected of a royal union. Tapestries depicting the glory of both kingdoms, musicians playing elaborate compositions, nobles from across Europe attending to witness this political alliance made flesh. Blanche wore a gown that cost more than most people would see in a lifetime, sewn with pearls and gold thread that caught the candlelight like captured stars. She looked every inch the fairy tale princess, radiant and elegant and utterly doomed. Because here's what nobody told Blanche about her new husband. Pedro the Cruel wasn't just a nickname, it was a warning. Pedro had already demonstrated his approach to problem-solving through violence. When nobles opposed him, he had them assassinated. When his half-brothers challenged his authority, he arranged their deaths. When cities resisted his rule, he laid siege until starvation brought surrender. This was a man who saw brutality as statecraft, who understood that fear could be more effective than diplomacy. And now this man, this walking embodiment of medieval tyranny, had just married a 16-year-old French princess who had no idea what she was walking into. The early signs should have been obvious. Pedro showed little interest in his new bride beyond the political advantages she represented. He was polite during public ceremonies, distant during private moments, and completely absent whenever possible. While Blanche tried to establish herself at the Castilian court, learning Spanish customs and building relationships with local nobles, Pedro was already planning his next political maneuver. Because he had a secret that would destroy everything, he was already in love with someone else. Maria de Padilla had captured Pedro's heart years before his marriage to Blanche. She was beautiful, intelligent, And most importantly, she was already pregnant with Pedro's child. In a world where royal succession determined the fate of kingdoms, this presented an impossible problem. Pedro was legally married to Blanche, but his heart and his heir belonged to Maria. Medieval law was clear about legitimate succession, but medieval kings had ways of interpreting law to suit their needs. The solution Pedro chose would shock even his contemporaries, who were hardly squeamish about royal brutality. Rather than seeking an annulment through proper church channels, rather than negotiating a diplomatic separation that would preserve everyone's dignity, Pedro decided to simply eliminate the problem. Not through divorce or exile or any of the conventional methods available to medieval royalty. He chose imprisonment, starvation, and psychological torture. He chose to break his wife slowly, methodically, until she either died or went mad. Preferably both. The first signs of Blanche's doom appeared within months of the wedding. Court observers noted that the young queen was spending more time in her private chambers, that her public appearances were becoming less frequent, that she seemed increasingly pale and withdrawn. The official explanation was that she was adjusting to her new role, learning the complexities of Castilian politics, preparing for the responsibilities of queenship. The reality was that Pedro was already beginning her systematic destruction. It started with isolation. Blanche's French attendants were dismissed, supposedly for security reasons. Her correspondence with her family in France was intercepted and often destroyed. Her access to certain parts of the palace was restricted, ostensibly to protect her from political intrigue. Step by step, day by day, the walls around the young queen were growing higher and thicker, cutting her off from the outside world that might have helped her. But isolation was just the beginning. Pedro understood that destroying someone requires more than just physical confinement. You have to attack their hope, their dignity, their very sense of self. You have to make them complicit in their own destruction. The psychological warfare began with small humiliations. Blanche would be excluded from important court ceremonies where her presence was expected. She would be served inferior food while guests dined on delicacies. Her requests for books, music, or other entertainments would be ignored or denied. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were calculated steps in a campaign designed to strip away everything that made her feel human. Contemporary chroniclers who witnessed this early phase of Blanche's destruction described a young woman desperately trying to maintain her dignity while the ground shifted beneath her feet. She continued to dress as befitted a queen, even when her wardrobe was deliberately restricted. She maintained her devotions and prayers even when access to her private chapel became irregular. She tried to fulfill her ceremonial duties, even when those duties were suddenly canceled or changed without notice. But Pedro was just getting started. The real horror was yet to come, because what happened next would transform a political marriage gone wrong into one of history's most documented cases of royal domestic abuse. The tower that would become Blanche's prison was already being prepared. The guards who would become her jailers were already being selected for their loyalty to Pedro and their indifference to human suffering. The slow, methodical process of starving a queen to death was about to begin. And the most terrifying part? Everything Pedro was doing was completely legal under medieval law. A king's authority over his wife was absolute. A husband's right to discipline was unquestioned. The church might disapprove. Foreign courts might whisper, but nobody would intervene. Because in the medieval world, what happened between a man and his wife was private business, even when that man was a king and his wife was dying in a tower. This is where our story takes its darkest turn, where political calculation becomes personal vendetta, where the fairy tale princess discovers that sometimes the monster doesn't just live in the castle. Sometimes the monster owns the castle, wears the crown, and has the absolute legal right to destroy anyone who stands in his way. The transformation from queen to prisoner didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, carefully orchestrated to avoid attracting too much attention from foreign observers who might report back to the French court. Pedro needed Blanche's destruction to look like natural causes, like illness or melancholy, or the mysterious afflictions that sometimes struck young women in medieval times. He couldn't simply execute her outright without triggering a war with France. But he could make her disappear slowly, methodically, until she was just another royal wife who had tragically succumbed to the pressures of medieval life. The tower chosen for Blanche's final imprisonment still stands today, a stone monument to medieval cruelty that tourists now visit without understanding the horror that once unfolded within its walls. The Tower of Sigüenza rose like a stone finger pointing accusingly at heaven, its thick walls designed to keep enemies out and secrets in. When the guards escorted Blanche up those winding stairs for the first time, she still believed this was temporary. A brief confinement while Pedro dealt with some political crisis. A precautionary measure that would end within days, maybe weeks. She had no way of knowing that she was climbing toward her own tomb, that these stone steps would be among the last she would ever take as a free woman. The room they locked her in was 12 feet by 8 feet. Stone walls, a single narrow window placed too high to see out of properly, a wooden door reinforced with iron bands. No tapestries to warm the walls, no carpets to soften the floor, no books, no music, no letters from home. Just stone and silence and the slow realization that this wasn't temporary at all. This was forever. But here's what makes Blanche's imprisonment so particularly cruel. Pedro didn't just lock her away and forget about her. He orchestrated her suffering with the precision of a master craftsman, controlling every aspect of her existence to maximize psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability. The guards who brought her food were instructed to arrive at irregular intervals, sometimes twice a day, sometimes not for days at a time. The portions were calculated to keep her alive, but constantly hungry, weak enough to prevent escape attempts, but strong enough to prolong her agony. The menu of her imprisonment reads like a deliberate program of malnutrition. Stale bread, often moldy. Thin broth that was more water than substance. Occasionally a piece of salted meat so tough it was nearly inedible. No fresh fruits, no vegetables, no variety that might provide proper nutrition, or even the small comfort of taste. Every meal was a reminder that she had been reduced from queen to prisoner, from human being to burden. Water was another weapon in Pedro's arsenal of control. Sometimes the guards would bring fresh water daily. Sometimes they would leave her with stagnant, foul-tasting liquid that made her sick. Sometimes they wouldn't bring water at all for days, watching as desperation drove her to drink from puddles that formed when rain leaked through the tower's ancient stones. The irregularity was the point. She could never know what to expect, could never establish routines that might provide psychological comfort. The clothing situation reveals the calculated nature of her torment. Blanche had arrived at the tower wearing the fine garments befitting a queen. Rich fabrics, elaborate embroidery, jewelry that caught the light. Over time, these were systematically removed. First, the jewelry disappeared, supposedly for safekeeping. Then the finest gowns were taken for cleaning and never returned. Month by month, her wardrobe was reduced until she wore simple peasant clothes, then rags, then whatever scraps the guards deigned to provide. This wasn't about practicality or security. This was about stripping away every external symbol of her identity as royalty, forcing her to confront her powerlessness every time she looked down at her deteriorating appearance. Pedro understood that dignity is often tied to how we present ourselves to the world. By controlling her clothing, he was controlling her sense of self. The hygiene situation was equally calculated to demoralize. No regular access to bathing facilities, no fresh linens for her bed, no way to properly clean herself or her living space. The accumulated filth became another prison, trapping her in her own degradation. Contemporary accounts suggest that visitors to the tower, on the rare occasions when any were permitted, could smell the imprisonment before they reached her door. But Pedro's cruelest innovation was the manipulation of hope itself. Just when Blanche's situation seemed stabilized in its awfulness, things would suddenly improve. Better food would arrive. Clean clothes would be provided. A guard might even bring news from the outside world, hints that Pedro was reconsidering her fate. These improvements would last just long enough for hope to resurface, for her to believe that maybe finally her ordeal was ending. Then conditions would worsen again, often dramatically. The food would become scarcer and more rotten. The guards would become more hostile, and the isolation would deepen. This cycle repeated throughout her imprisonment. a psychological torture technique that prevented her from adapting to consistent conditions. Every time she found ways to cope with her circumstances, Pedro changed those circumstances to break her again. The letters provide the most heartbreaking evidence of this systematic psychological destruction. Blanche was occasionally permitted to write to her family in France, but these letters were heavily monitored and often censored. She learned to write in code, hiding desperate pleas for help within seemingly innocent family correspondence. Her French relatives received messages that appeared to describe normal royal life while actually documenting systematic abuse. One letter preserved in the French royal archives demonstrates her desperation. Written in 1357, 4 years into her imprisonment, it describes her joy at receiving a gift of fabric from her mother. But read carefully, the letter reveals that the fabric was actually rags, that her joy was sarcasm born of despair, that she was begging for rescue while maintaining the pretense that everything was normal. The French court, bound by diplomatic protocol and uncertain about the truth of her situation, failed to act decisively. The guards selected for Blanche's imprisonment were chosen for specific qualities that made them perfect instruments of psychological torture. They were foreigners, men who spoke little Spanish and no French, making communication nearly impossible. They were rotated frequently, preventing her from building any human connections that might provide comfort. They were instructed to treat her with calculated indifference, neither cruel enough to generate sympathy nor kind enough to provide relief. These men became extensions of Pedro's will, implementing his vision of gradual destruction without question or compassion. They followed their orders with bureaucratic precision, treating the slow murder of a queen as just another job to be completed efficiently. Their daily reports, some of which survive in Spanish archives, read like medical observations of a deteriorating patient rather than accounts of human suffering. The physical deterioration was carefully documented by observers who occasionally gained access to the tower. Blanche, once described as radiantly beautiful, became gaunt and hollow-eyed. Her hair, previously her crowning glory, grew thin and brittle from malnutrition. Her skin took on the pallor of someone who rarely saw sunlight. Her clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost the healthy fullness of youth and prosperity. But the psychological changes were even more dramatic. The confident young woman who had once navigated French court politics with intelligence and grace became withdrawn and fearful. She would flinch when guards entered her cell, cower when voices were raised, speak in whispers even when alone. The systematic erosion of her dignity had accomplished exactly what Pedro intended. She was being transformed from a queen into a broken thing that barely remembered what it meant to be human. The religious dimension of her suffering adds another layer of cruelty to Pedro's campaign. Blanche was deeply devout, finding comfort in prayer and religious observance even as everything else was stripped away. Pedro used this against her, controlling her access to religious materials and services as another tool of psychological manipulation. Sometimes she would be permitted to attend Mass in the tower's small chapel. Sometimes her prayer books would be confiscated. Sometimes priests would visit to hear her confession, and sometimes she would be denied spiritual comfort for months at a time. The winter of 1358 marked a particular low point in her ordeal. The tower, always cold, became nearly uninhabitable as temperatures dropped, and snow blocked the narrow window that provided her only source of natural light. Her requests for additional clothing or blankets were ignored. Guards reported finding her huddled in corners, trying to preserve body heat while frostbite blackened her fingers and toes. It was during this winter that she began showing signs of the madness that Pedro had been systematically cultivating. Guards reported hearing her talking to herself, having conversations with people who weren't there, singing childhood songs from France in a voice that cracked with despair. The isolation, malnutrition, and psychological torture were achieving their intended effect. The brilliant young woman who had once been considered a prize worthy of international negotiation was disappearing, replaced by something broken and strange. Spring brought no relief. If anything, Pedro intensified his campaign as he grew impatient with the slowness of her destruction. The food became more irregular, the clothing more inadequate, the isolation more complete. It was as if he had decided that subtle torture was taking too long, and more direct methods were required to achieve his goals. By 1359, 6 years into her imprisonment, Blanche had become something that barely resembled the princess who had once danced at royal courts across Europe. She was a ghost haunting her own life, a warning of what happened to those who stood between medieval kings and their desires. And still she endured, clinging to life with a stubbornness that frustrated her captors and amazed the few observers who knew the truth of her situation. The tower had become her entire world, its stone walls the boundaries of an existence that had shrunk to the basic functions of survival. Eating when food appeared, drinking when water was provided, sleeping when exhaustion overcame the discomfort of her circumstances, praying when prayer books were available, waiting, always waiting, for an end that seemed both inevitable and impossibly distant. But Pedro wasn't finished with her yet. The final phase of her destruction was about to begin, and it would make everything she had already endured seem like mere preparation for the ultimate horror that awaited in the depths of a Spanish winter that would claim not just her body, but her very identity as a human being. The winter of 1360 arrived like a physical presence in the tower, seeping through ancient stones and settling into Blanche's bones with the permanence of death itself. But this wasn't just another seasonal hardship to endure. This was Pedro's final gambit, his ultimate demonstration that even royal blood could be frozen in Spanish stone when a king willed it so. The food deliveries, already irregular and inadequate, now became exercises in deliberate starvation. Where once she might receive moldy bread every other day, now weeks would pass with nothing but the foul water that collected in stone basins. The guards would arrive with empty hands and watch her face as hope died in her eyes, documenting her desperation in reports that read like scientific observations of human degradation. Here's what makes this final phase so particularly monstrous. Pedro had perfected the art of keeping someone alive while systematically destroying their will to live. The portions he allowed were calculated with mathematical precision, enough to prevent immediate death from starvation, but never enough to provide the strength needed for resistance or escape. Too much food, and she might recover some vitality. Too little, and she would die quickly, ending his entertainment. The balance required constant adjustment, constant observation, constant cruelty. The psychological torture reached new heights of sophistication during these final months. Guards would bring news from the outside world, specifically chosen to maximize her anguish. Maria de Padilla had given birth to another of Pedro's children. The French court had stopped inquiring about her welfare. Her family had begun discussing her succession as if she were already dead. Each piece of information was a knife thrust into whatever remained of her hope. But here's the truly diabolical element of Pedro's campaign. He began allowing visitors to see her, carefully selected witnesses who would spread word of her condition throughout Europe while maintaining his plausible deniability. Foreign ambassadors would be permitted brief audiences with the imprisoned queen, always under strict supervision, always with carefully scripted interactions that made her appear mad rather than tortured. These diplomatic performances became exercises in gaslighting that would impress modern psychological warfare experts. Blanche would be cleaned up just enough to appear presentable, given slightly better food for a few days before the visit, then presented to ambassadors as a melancholy queen, suffering from feminine hysteria rather than systematic abuse. Her attempts to communicate the truth of her situation were dismissed as the ravings of an unbalanced mind. The ambassador's reports, preserved in various European archives, paint a picture of a woman who appeared to be suffering from mental illness rather than deliberate torture. They described her strange behavior, her inappropriate responses to questions, her tendency to speak in fragments about persecution and imprisonment. What they failed to recognize was that these weren't symptoms of madness, but the predictable results of years of psychological torture designed to make her appear insane. Pedro's mastery of medieval public relations was evident in how he managed these visits. The timing was always perfect, occurring when Blanche was at her most vulnerable, her most broken. The setting was carefully arranged to emphasize her apparent comfort rather than her imprisonment. The conversations were monitored and guided to prevent any clear communication of abuse. And the aftermath always included subtle suggestions that the queen's distress stemmed from her inability to provide heirs rather than from systematic mistreatment. The religious manipulation during this period reveals Pedro's understanding of medieval psychology with chilling clarity. Blanche's faith had been her last refuge, the one thing that provided meaning in her destroyed existence. Pedro used this against her with surgical precision, controlling her access to religious comfort as another instrument of torture. Priests would arrive to hear her confession, then leave without providing absolution. Religious texts would be brought to her cell, then confiscated just as she began finding solace in familiar prayers. Holy days would be acknowledged with promises of special observances that never materialized. Even her relationship with God became another battlefield, where Pedro held all the weapons and made all the rules. The physical evidence of her deterioration became impossible to hide, even from carefully managed diplomatic visits. Her weight had dropped to levels that shocked observers accustomed to the robust health expected of royalty. Her hair had become thin and gray, aged decades beyond her actual years. Her skin had taken on the translucent quality of parchment, marked with sores that wouldn't heal due to poor nutrition and unsanitary conditions. But the most disturbing changes were behavioral. The intelligent, articulate princess who had once charmed French courtiers with her wit and wisdom had been replaced by someone who spoke in whispers, flinched at sudden movements, and seemed to inhabit a reality increasingly disconnected from the physical world around her. This wasn't mental illness in any medical sense. This was the predictable result of systematic psychological destruction carried out over years with scientific precision. The guards reported increasingly strange behaviors that Pedro received like progress reports on a successful experiment. Blanche would spend hours staring at the narrow window, apparently watching scenes that existed only in her memory. She would conduct elaborate conversations with invisible companions, reenacting court ceremonies from her childhood in France with tragic attention to detail. She would arrange and rearrange the few possessions left to her, as if preparing for events that would never come. These behaviors weren't random symptoms of madness, but desperate attempts to maintain some connection to her lost identity. In a world where everything familiar had been stripped away, her mind created alternative realities where she could still function as the person she had once been. The tragedy wasn't that she was going mad. The tragedy was that maintaining sanity required her to fully accept the horror of her situation, and human minds aren't designed to sustain that level of despair indefinitely. The correspondence during this period becomes increasingly heartbreaking as Blanche's ability to communicate coherently deteriorated. Letters to her family, when permitted, became exercises in coded desperation that grew more difficult to decipher as her mental state fragmented. She would write about imaginary court events, describing elaborate ceremonies and celebrations that existed only in her increasingly confused memory. French archivists who preserved these letters noted their disturbing progression from subtle pleas for help to disconnected ramblings about people and events that made no sense to anyone familiar with actual court life. What they didn't understand was that these weren't the products of mental illness, but the last gasp of a brilliant mind trying to maintain some connection to meaning and purpose in circumstances designed to destroy both. The winter weather became Pedro's unwitting ally in his campaign of destruction. The tower, never designed for long-term habitation, became a stone refrigerator that preserved Blanche's suffering while accelerating her physical decline. The narrow window that provided her only source of natural light was often blocked by snow and ice, leaving her in darkness for days at a time. The cold affected every aspect of her existence. Food froze in her cell before she could eat it. Water became ice that had to be melted with body heat before consumption. The thin clothing provided by her guards offered no protection against temperatures that would challenge healthy, well-fed individuals, let alone someone weakened by years of malnutrition and abuse. Frostbite became a constant companion, blackening her fingers and toes while spreading slowly up her extremities. Guards reported finding her huddled in corners, trying to preserve core body temperature while ice formed on the walls around her. The physical pain of freezing added another dimension to her psychological torture, making sleep impossible and turning every moment into an exercise in basic survival. But Pedro's cruelest innovation during this final winter was the manipulation of heating. Occasionally, without warning or explanation, guards would bring braziers to warm her cell. The sudden relief from cold would revive her spirits and her hope, making her believe that perhaps her ordeal was finally ending. Then, just as suddenly, the heat sources would be removed, plunging her back into freezing conditions that felt even worse by comparison. This cycle of warming and cooling became another form of psychological torture, preventing her from adapting to consistently cold conditions while maintaining the false hope that her situation might improve. Each removal of heat was a fresh betrayal, a reminder that even basic comfort existed only at Pedro's whim and could be withdrawn at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. The medical evidence from this period, reconstructed from guard reports and diplomatic observations, suggests that Blanche was suffering from multiple conditions that would have been fatal individually, let alone in combination. Severe malnutrition had compromised her immune system, making her vulnerable to infections that her body couldn't fight. Vitamin deficiencies had caused her teeth to loosen and her bones to become brittle. The constant cold had damaged her circulation, creating wounds that wouldn't heal properly. Yet she continued to live, continued to endure, with a stubbornness that amazed even her tormentors. This wasn't the result of exceptional physical strength, but of something deeper, some core of human dignity that refused to be completely extinguished, despite Pedro's best efforts. Every day she survived was a small victory against the system designed to destroy her, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit even under impossible circumstances. The political situation during this period reveals how thoroughly Pedro had succeeded in isolating his victim from potential sources of help. The French court, initially concerned about their princess's welfare, had gradually accepted the narrative that she was suffering from melancholy and female hysteria rather than systematic abuse. Diplomatic inquiries became less frequent and less urgent as Pedro's carefully managed information campaign took effect. Other European courts, already dealing with their own political crises and military challenges, found it convenient to accept Pedro's version of events rather than investigating claims that would require expensive and dangerous intervention. The Holy Roman Emperor was fighting wars on multiple fronts. The Pope was dealing with schisms that threatened the unity of the Church. England and France were locked in their seemingly endless conflict. Nobody had the resources or motivation to rescue one imprisoned princess, especially when her captor was a fellow Christian monarch who insisted she was receiving appropriate care. This international indifference wasn't accidental, but the result of Pedro's sophisticated understanding of medieval diplomacy. He had correctly calculated that other powers would choose political convenience over moral obligation, that the effort required to verify and address Blanche's situation would exceed any benefits they might gain from intervention. He had turned the complexity of international relations into another weapon against his victim, ensuring that her suffering would remain invisible to those with the power to end it. The Church's response during this period reveals the institutional failures that enabled medieval domestic abuse on a royal scale. While individual priests who encountered Blanche expressed private concerns about her condition, the Church as an institution was reluctant to challenge a Christian monarch's authority over his wife. Canon law was clear about husbands' rights to discipline their wives, and even obvious abuse could be rationalized as necessary correction of feminine weakness. Papal representatives who visited Spain during this period filed reports that acknowledged Blanche's distressing condition, while carefully avoiding any direct accusations against Pedro. They described her apparent mental instability and physical decline in terms that suggested natural causes rather than deliberate abuse. Their recommendations focused on prayer and spiritual guidance rather than intervention or protection, effectively abandoning her to her fate while maintaining the pretense of pastoral care. This ecclesiastical abandonment was particularly cruel given Blanche's deep faith and her reasonable expectation that the Church would provide sanctuary for the innocent. Instead, religious authorities became unwitting accomplices in her destruction, lending a moral legitimacy to Pedro's actions through their refusal to acknowledge the obvious truth of her situation. The final months of 1360 brought an acceleration in Blanche's decline that even Pedro's guards found disturbing. Her weight had dropped to levels that made her appearance shocking, even to men accustomed to violence and suffering. Her speech had become increasingly incoherent, mixing French and Spanish in ways that suggested her mind was retreating into childhood memories, where language barriers didn't exist. Most ominously, she had begun refusing food even when it was offered, a development that concerned Pedro's advisors who worried about the political ramifications of her death, appearing too obviously connected to starvation. Guards were instructed to force-feed her when necessary, adding physical violence to the psychological torture that had already broken her spirit. These forced feedings became grotesque parodies of care, violent assaults disguised as medical intervention. Guards would hold her down while forcing gruel down her throat, causing injuries to her mouth and esophagus that made eating painful even when she was willing to try. The pretense of keeping her alive for her own good masked the reality that Pedro was determined to control even the timing and manner of her death. As winter deepened and 1361 approached, it became clear that Blanche's ordeal was entering its final phase. The systematic destruction that had taken 7 years to complete was approaching its inevitable conclusion, and Pedro was already preparing the narratives that would explain her death in terms acceptable to international observers. The imprisoned queen had become a problem to be solved through careful management of information and timing, but even in her extremity, even as her body failed and her mind retreated from unbearable reality, Blanche retained some spark of the intelligence and dignity that had once made her worthy of a crown. Her final acts would be small gestures of defiance that Pedro couldn't control, last assertions of humanity that no amount of torture could completely extinguish. The end was coming, but it would arrive on her terms as much as his, in ways that would ensure her story survived even when everything else had been stripped away. The evidence of Blanche's final defiance comes to us through the most unlikely source imaginable. A kitchen servant named Catalina, whose job was to scrub the stone floors of the tower, began smuggling out small pieces of parchment that the dying queen had somehow acquired. These weren't formal letters or political documents. They were fragments, scraps really, covered in handwriting, that grew shakier with each passing week. But they contained something that would outlive every monument Pedro ever built to his own glory: poetry. Even as her body failed and her mind retreated from the unbearable present, Blanche was composing verses in French, Spanish, and Latin that captured not just her own suffering, but the universal experience of powerlessness in the face of absolute authority. These weren't the sophisticated court poems of her youth, but raw, desperate expressions of a human soul refusing to be completely extinguished. One fragment, preserved in a monastery near Toledo, translates roughly as "Stone walls know my name, though the world forgets. Winter lives in my bones, but spring remembers my laughter." Another, written in a mixture of languages that suggests her mind was moving freely between past and present, speaks of dancing with ghosts in a ballroom made of shadows. The guards who found these scraps of parchment were instructed to burn them immediately, but Catalina had already begun her own small rebellion. Every piece of Blanche's writing that she could save was smuggled out of the tower, hidden in baskets of kitchen refuse, then passed to a network of servants who recognized something precious in these last gasps of creativity from a woman the world had abandoned. Pedro never learned about this literary resistance movement operating under his nose. While he was orchestrating the physical destruction of his wife's body, he had no idea that her spirit was escaping through words that would survive long after her flesh had returned to dust. The irony would have infuriated him if he'd known. His most carefully controlled victim was writing her way to a kind of immortality that his violence couldn't touch. The winter solstice of 1360 marked what contemporary observers would later recognize as the beginning of Blanche's final decline. The astronomical event that should have promised the return of longer days instead seemed to trigger something in her already fragmented psyche. Guards reported finding her attempting to mark the passage of time by scratching lines into the stone walls with her fingernails, counting days and months with obsessive precision. But these weren't random scratches. They formed patterns, calculations that suggest she was trying to determine the exact length of her imprisonment down to the hour. 7 years, 4 months, 18 days, 6 hours. The precision was heartbreaking, a mathematical monument to endurance that transformed her cell into a calendar of suffering measured in heartbeats and breaths. The forced feeding sessions became increasingly violent as Blanche's body began rejecting sustenance entirely. What had started as refusal born of despair had evolved into something more fundamental. Her digestive system, damaged by years of irregular nutrition and contaminated food, could no longer process even the simple gruel that guards forced down her throat. The violent retching that followed these sessions left her weaker each time, creating a cycle of forced nourishment and inevitable rejection that accelerated her physical collapse. Pedro's physicians, when they bothered to examine her at all, documented symptoms that read like a medical textbook of systematic abuse. Severe malnutrition had caused her hair to fall out in patches, leaving her scalp covered with angry sores that wouldn't heal. Her teeth had loosened in her gums, making even soft foods painful to chew. Her skin had taken on a yellowish pallor that spoke of organ failure, while her extremities showed the blackened evidence of frostbite that had progressed beyond treatment. Yet the most disturbing changes were neurological. The brilliant princess who had once conducted diplomatic negotiations in 4 languages now struggled to form coherent sentences in any tongue. Her speech had become a mixture of childhood French lullabies, fragments of Spanish prayers, and Latin phrases from masses she had attended decades earlier. Time had collapsed in her mind, creating a mental landscape where past and present existed simultaneously. The guards assigned to her final months were chosen specifically for their ability to witness human suffering without emotional response. These weren't cruel men in the traditional sense, but bureaucrats of brutality, professionals who could document the systematic destruction of a human being with the detached precision of clerks recording grain shipments. Their reports, preserved in Spanish archives, read like veterinary observations of a dying animal rather than accounts of a queen's murder. But even these hardened men began showing signs of unease as Blanche's condition deteriorated beyond anything they had witnessed before. One guard, writing to his superior, noted that the prisoner had begun speaking to invisible companions with such conviction that he found himself looking around the cell for people who weren't there. Another reported that she would conduct elaborate court ceremonies using pieces of straw as participants, addressing them with the formal etiquette appropriate for foreign ambassadors. These behaviors weren't random symptoms of madness, but desperate attempts to maintain some connection to her lost identity as royalty. In her mind, she was still conducting the business of queenship, still fulfilling the ceremonial obligations that had defined her existence before the tower became her world. The tragedy wasn't that she had lost touch with reality, but that she was creating alternative realities where dignity and purpose could still exist. The political maneuvering around her impending death reached fever pitch as 1361 dawned with no improvement in her condition. Pedro's advisors were growing nervous about the international ramifications of her obvious decline, particularly given the increasing frequency of inquiries from the French court. A dead queen required explanations that a merely imprisoned one did not, and those explanations would need to satisfy allies who were already suspicious of Pedro's methods. The solution they devised reveals the sophisticated nature of medieval propaganda warfare. Rather than continuing to claim that Blanche was merely melancholy or suffering from feminine hysteria, Pedro's court began circulating rumors that she had contracted a wasting disease, possibly the same mysterious illness that had claimed several other European nobles in recent years. This narrative had the advantage of explaining both her physical deterioration and her impending death while removing any suggestion of deliberate harm. Physicians were brought to the tower not to treat Blanche, but to document symptoms that would support this fabricated diagnosis. Their reports, carefully crafted to obscure rather than illuminate the truth, described a patient suffering from an unknown malady that caused progressive weakness, mental confusion, and resistance to treatment. The fact that these symptoms perfectly matched those of systematic starvation and psychological torture was presented as mere coincidence. The religious dimension of her final weeks adds another layer of horror to an already unbearable situation. As death approached, Blanche began requesting last rites with increasing urgency, apparently lucid enough to understand that her time was running out. But Pedro used even this final spiritual comfort as another tool of psychological manipulation, controlling her access to priests and sacraments with the same calculated cruelty he had applied to food and warmth. Sometimes priests would arrive and conduct abbreviated rituals that provided no real comfort or spiritual preparation for death. Sometimes they would be turned away at the last moment, leaving Blanche to face another night of suffering without the religious consolation that medieval Christians considered essential for salvation. The uncertainty was the point. Even in dying, she couldn't know what to expect, couldn't find peace in established rituals that should have provided comfort in her final hours. The few priests who did gain access to her cell left disturbing accounts of what they found. One described a woman so physically diminished that she appeared to be a child playing dress-up in adult clothing. Another wrote of someone who spoke with such fervor about reunion with deceased family members that he wondered if she was already experiencing visions of the afterlife. These weren't comfortable deathbed scenes of peaceful acceptance, but glimpses into the mind of someone whose suffering had become so extreme that death appeared as a long-awaited rescue. Catalina, the kitchen servant who had become Blanche's inadvertent chronicler, later testified that the final weeks brought a strange calm to the imprisoned queen. The frantic energy of earlier months, the desperate attempts to maintain routines and connections to her former life, had given way to something that looked almost like serenity. But this wasn't peace born of acceptance. It was the exhaustion of someone who had fought beyond the limits of human endurance and simply had nothing left to give. The last piece of writing that survived from Blanche's hand was found scratched into the stone beside her sleeping area. Unlike her earlier verses, this wasn't poetry, but a simple statement written in Latin that translates as, "I forgive him." Whether this referred to Pedro, to God, or to some other figure from her past remains unclear. But the words themselves, carved with what must have been enormous effort given her physical condition, represent a final assertion of moral authority over her tormentor. Pedro never learned about this last message, which was discovered only after her death when servants were cleaning the cell. If he had known, he might have recognized it as the ultimate victory of his victim over his carefully orchestrated campaign of destruction. In forgiving him, Blanche had claimed a moral high ground that no amount of royal authority could reach, transforming herself from victim to victor in the only arena where such transformation was still possible. The final days of January 1361 brought weather so severe that even the guards struggled to reach the tower through snowdrifts that blocked the narrow stairs. Blanche, already weakened beyond recovery, faced this last assault of winter without adequate clothing, heating, or nutrition. Her body, which had somehow endured 7 years of systematic abuse, finally began the process of complete surrender. But even in these final moments, witnesses reported behavior that suggested her mind had found refuge in places Pedro couldn't reach. She was observed having animated conversations with invisible companions, apparently reliving happier moments from her childhood in France when she had been loved, protected, and valued for herself rather than her political utility. These weren't hallucinations born of fever, but conscious retreats into memories that torture couldn't touch. The guards found her on the morning of February the 1st, 1361, curled in the corner where she had spent so many nights trying to preserve body heat against the stone walls that had become her world. She had died quietly, without the dramatic final words or gestures that medieval chroniclers expected from royal deaths. There was no last-minute confession, no deathbed forgiveness, no spiritual revelation that might have provided meaning to her suffering. There was only silence and the small pile of straw that had served as her bed, and the scratched words on the wall that would outlive every monument Pedro ever built to his own glory. The woman who should have been Queen of Castile had died as she had lived her final years, alone and forgotten by the world that had once celebrated her beauty and grace. But death, it turned out, would not be the end of her story, because the servants who had smuggled out her writings, the priests who had witnessed her final weeks, and the guards who had documented her destruction would carry her memory beyond the tower walls where Pedro thought he had buried it forever. The silence he had imposed through violence would be broken by voices he could never control, telling a story he had tried to erase. Pedro had succeeded in murdering his wife, but he had failed to kill her story. And that failure would haunt him for the rest of his reign because the truth has a way of surviving even the most carefully orchestrated cover-ups. The official announcement of Blanche's death was a masterpiece of medieval spin control. The court physicians declared that she had succumbed to a mysterious wasting disease that had plagued her for months despite the best medical care available. Foreign ambassadors were told that everything possible had been done to save the beloved queen, that her death was a tragic loss that had devastated the entire kingdom. Masses were said for her soul, and Pedro himself appeared publicly in mourning clothes, playing the part of the grieving widower with convincing theatrical skill. But the servants knew better. The kitchen staff who had prepared her meager rations, the guards who had witnessed her systematic destruction, the priest who had been denied access to her cell, they all carried pieces of the real story. And in a world where information traveled through whispered conversations and clandestine letters, the truth began to spread like water through cracks in stone. Catalina, the brave kitchen servant who had preserved Blanche's final writings, became an unlikely guardian of historical truth. She carried those fragments of parchment to a monastery outside Toledo, where sympathetic monks recognized their significance and began copying them before the originals crumbled to dust. These verses, written by a dying queen in a freezing tower, would outlive every official document Pedro ever commissioned about his reign. The French court's reaction to news of Blanche's death reveals the international political calculations that had doomed her from the beginning. While privately suspicious about the circumstances, they publicly accepted Pedro's explanation and even sent formal condolences on the loss of their daughter. The same political pragmatism that had sacrificed her to secure an alliance now demanded that her death not be allowed to disrupt that same alliance. She had been valuable as a living diplomatic tool. Dead, she was merely an unfortunate casualty of medieval marriage politics. But history has a way of rendering final judgments that escape the control of kings and diplomats. Pedro's reputation, already stained by his nickname, the Cruel, would be forever defined by what he had done to his innocent wife. Medieval chroniclers, writing decades after these events, would describe Blanche's murder as the act that proved Pedro's fundamental evil. The crime that revealed a man who had abandoned all pretense of Christian kingship in favor of pure brutality. The tower where she died became a monument to royal cruelty that no amount of official propaganda could transform into something noble. Visitors to Siguenza even today can see the narrow window through which winter wind brought death to a French princess who had committed no crime beyond marrying the wrong man. The scratched words on the wall, "I forgive him," remain visible to anyone who knows where to look, a testament to dignity that torture couldn't break. Maria de Padilla, the woman for whom Blanche had been sacrificed, would discover that Pedro's capacity for cruelty wasn't limited to wives he wanted to eliminate. When she too became inconvenient, when her political usefulness was exhausted, she would face her own mysterious death, under circumstances that suggested Pedro had applied the lessons learned from his first wife's murder. The man who had killed for love would kill love itself when it no longer served his purposes. The ultimate irony of Pedro's campaign against Blanche is that it accomplished the opposite of what he intended. Rather than erasing her from history, his extreme cruelty ensured that she would be remembered long after his other victims were forgotten. The very thoroughness of his destruction became evidence of his guilt. The meticulous documentation of her suffering a record of his crimes that no royal propaganda could overcome. Today, when we visit the museums that display medieval artifacts, when we read histories that describe the pageantry and romance of royal courts, we're seeing the sanitized version of a world that was often brutally indifferent to human suffering. Blanche's story reminds us that behind every crown was the potential for absolute power to corrupt absolutely, that the fairy tale princess was just as likely to die in a tower as to live happily ever after. Her death marked the end of a life that had been reduced to a political calculation, but it also marked the beginning of a different kind of immortality. Because sometimes the most powerful victory over tyranny isn't resistance or escape, but simply refusing to let cruelty have the final word. In forgiving her murderer, in continuing to write poetry even as she died, in maintaining her humanity despite systematic attempts to destroy it, Blanche achieved something that Pedro's violence couldn't touch. She proved that dignity can survive torture, that love can outlast hate, and that even the most carefully orchestrated campaigns of destruction can't completely erase the truth. The princess who died alone in a Spanish tower had won a victory that her tormentor would never understand. A triumph measured not in years of life, but in the eternal power of human spirit to transcend the worst that other humans can inflict. Pedro the Cruel died 28 years later, killed by his own half-brother in a struggle for power that made his reign's violence seem almost routine. His tomb bears elaborate inscriptions praising his military victories and political achievements, but history remembers him primarily as the king who tortured his wife to death. That's his legacy, carved not in stone, but in the collective memory of a species that recognizes evil when it sees it, no matter how much royal authority tries to disguise it as justice. Blanche of Bourbon, who never ruled a kingdom, who never commanded armies, who never built monuments to her own glory, achieved something more lasting than any of Pedro's accomplishments. She became a symbol of innocent suffering that speaks across centuries to anyone who has ever faced impossible odds, who has ever been abandoned by those with the power to help, who has ever found that their only choice was how to face destruction with whatever dignity they could preserve. The tower still stands. The story still matters. And somewhere in those stone walls, scratched in letters worn smooth by centuries but still visible to those who look carefully, the words remain, "I forgive him." Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because she deserved to be more than his victim. In the end, that choice to transcend hatred through love was the only power Pedro couldn't take from her, the only victory he couldn't steal, the only throne he couldn't usurp. That's the real lesson of Princess Blanche's tragedy. Not that medieval marriage was brutal, though it was. Not that absolute power corrupts, though it does. But that human dignity is ultimately beyond the reach of human cruelty, that the spirit can survive what the body cannot, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to let evil have the last word. Her story lives on because it has to, because forgetting it would mean forgetting something essential about what it means to be human, in a world where power and compassion too often find themselves at war.